In this tutorial, we're going to be creating the speed meter. Speed meter is super important because it's going to be what tells you how fast you're moving. So if you know you're just under the limit for what it takes to land on a pad. Before we can do that though, we're going to need a player object because that's the thing we're going to be measuring the speed on. So in here in the hierarchy, let's right click and let's create a 3D object. Let's add a cube. And let's rename that player. I'm going to move him away from the UI. Just get him over here. And I think just for giggles, so it'll be easier to keep track of, let's add the rocket art to the player. Yeah. You can just double click here on player and get it nice and close. Now I'm going to switch back out of 2D mode. Notice that the rocket, at least on mine, I don't know where it is on yours, but on mine the rocket art is not centered. I'm going to bring that back over here. So we've got this box as our player object. We need to make the player basically have a collider, and that's where the cube comes in. You can actually see that box on mine sticking through, and that's important. I'm going to resize the box a bit, just to, oops, wrong thing to do there. Yeah, if you resize the player parent object, the rocket art's going to change. So let's just take the rocket art for now and unparented it, right? So now they're kind of close together, and we can scale this box. I want to scale and move, and basically the idea of what I'm doing and what I want you to do is I want you to try to resize the box so it basically fits the size and shape, roughly the size and shape of your rocket art. Yeah, just kind of have a look around. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it does need to be roughly the shape, and it needs to also more than anything, it needs to be accurate near the bottom. We want the bottom to be really close. Okay, all right, that's close enough for me. Now I'm going to take that rocket art and I'm going to parent it back to the player. Over here on the player, we need to add a few components to make this thing work. First thing, let's just turn off the mesh renderer. We don't care about the mesh renderer. We don't need to see that. But we do notice that it has this nice green outline. That is our collider. That's what we're going to use to detect whether we've run into something or not. Okay, add a component. We need to get a rigid body on here. And a rigid body is the component Unity uses for physics. And our game is a physics game, so we need to have that. And I'm going to go ahead and show you a couple of other things too, just to save you some heartache. We want to freeze the rotation. We do not want this rocket to be able to turn around and around. We don't want to freeze its position. We absolutely do want it to move, but we don't want it to rotate around. And we also don't want to use gravity, so uncheck that. If we left the gravity on, if you do leave that on, when you press play, your object will just start falling. But we're sort of in a low G kind of environment where we want to just drift based on our rocket, so we're going to turn gravity off. So that's all we need to do for now. We will come back to the player script later, but we do now have a physics component and a player in our scene. Let's go back to the canvas. So I mentioned earlier that we are going to make a speed meter. So I'm switching to the 2D mode. And I double clicked on canvas to kind of get scrolled back a bit. And I'm going to create another text object. So right click on canvas, go to UI, and go to text. And this is our speed. So let's rename this speed. Now, if you remember earlier, I mentioned that there's dozens of ways to do the same thing. We're going to do a slightly different thing for speed than we did for fuel remaining, just because I want to be able to show you that there's multiple ways to do a thing. Before, what we did is we had a dynamic portion for fuel remaining. I'm sorry, we had a we had a static part for fuel remaining and a dynamic number. Those two were two separate objects. We're going to make this object be one object, one text object, and it's going to sort of build a string out of itself. So it'll say speed, current speed, and then it'll also give the number for that. So we're going to do that all as one object instead of two. So for example, let's just type in sort of a kind of a placeholder one. So current speed, or maybe let's just do speed, and then colon, and then let's do a number something like, like 999. And that's really hard to see. I'm going to make it white against the background. And we were doing 24 size before, so I'm going to do that. And then I'm going to move the speed object to be just below my fuel remaining. And then I'm going to anchor that to the top center. Okay, so now let's add a script to this object. Add FSM. Now this is going to be one of the simplest scripts in terms of states that you'll ever make, because we are only going to have one single state. And we're doing that because no matter what's happening in the game, when the game starts, we care about how fast the player is going, whether or not they're doing anything or not. For example, with 0G, when you press your rockets, you're going to start drifting in a direction at a certain speed, and you're going to stay at that speed and direction until you act upon it. So we want to know what that speed is at all times. So every frame of the game, we will be checking and updating this speed UI. And so the first thing we have to do in this state is we need to get the speed of the object that we care about, which is the player. So open up your action browser and type in get speed. And then just add that there, right? The first thing it does is it yells at you, right? Like, you need a rigid body component. And so, well, we don't want to know the speed of this text object, it's 0. So we care about the player. So use this button here, click on it, and do specify game object. And then we want to left click and drag player into that box. Just get that in there, right? Now the warning goes away because we have a rigid body on that player object. We don't necessarily have to store this. Oh, actually, I take that back. We do need to store this. This is the speed variable. We do have a global variable for fuel, but we don't want to store it as fuel. We want to store it as a new variable, a new global variable called speed. So go to new global, and let's type in speed. All right. Now we've just got the speed of the player. Now, similar to what we did before, we need to convert that float into a string. This is what we did for the fuel object, if you remember. So type that in, type in convert float to string. Now look what's happened. It's put this one at the top, and we don't want that to happen first. We actually want get speed to happen first, so make sure that stays at the top. And which float variable do we need to convert? Well, we care about speed in this case, so find the speed variable. And we want to change that into a variable, a string one, and we need a new one. So we don't need a global for this one. This is just local to the UI, so we can just use this one. So we can call this one speed str. Again, you can call it whatever you like. I like putting that spelled like that. And then I'm similar to what we did for fuel. I'm going to do the same thing for the format because I only care about a certain amount of decimal points. 2 decimal points is plenty. 0, 0, 0. Okay. And then the last thing we need to do, now that we've got the speed, we've converted it into a string, we want to set the property. So let's do that. Just left click and drag the text object into here, right? And then hit set property. Again, left click on the text script name and left click, drag into this area here. Okay, and we're looking for the text thing, string. And the value is currently blank. We want to use a variable, and we care about speed string, right? Now what's going to happen right now if well, let's just try it, right? Let's find out what happens. I can tell you what's going to happen is it's going to get the speed of the player object, which is going to be 0. it's going to convert that into a string, which is going to be 0, and it's going to display our little speed 999 into 0. Let's just check that out. Yeah, so that's not what we wanted. We wanted the word speed and then the number. So how do we do that? Well, there's this really great action called build string. So type that into your action browser and then add this in here. Now this needs to be just above set property, so left click and drag and get that there, right? So we'll convert the float to a string, we'll save it as speed string, and then we're going to build this string, and then we'll actually save it into the text object. So the way this works is it says, hey, how many parts, right? Well, we've got 2 parts. We've got the word speed, and then we've got the number. So we really only need 2. So change that 3 to a 2. Okay. And then here in element 0, we want the first part to read speed, and we're going to go ahead and put our colon in there. And then here in element 2, we don't want to type something in. We want this to be the variable. So use this little button here to change it to a variable. And we have speed string, right? So now it would say speed, and then it would grab the variable, which for us is going to be 0 currently. And so it would then spit out speed, colon, 0. And then it has this little thing called separator. For us, we want to separate those 2 elements with a space. So just put a single space in there. And then we'll store the result as speed string, and then it will do that here. So another thing that I want to point out before we get started that's super important for this, since we want this to happen every frame, we want it to constantly being updated, we need to check all these boxes for every frame. If you don't do this, it'll only ever do it once. So go through all these actions and hit every frame. Oops, there we go. Okay. And that is our speed state. So let's get to our player object. Now that we've got a monitor for speed, we want to set the player up. So click on your player and let's right click and add an FSM. So the way the player is going to work, the player is going to basically just be an input listener, and we are going to we're going to be listening for different button presses. And the player is going to be a pretty sophisticated object. It's going to have a Playmaker script for moving. It's also going to have a Playmaker script for fuel, and it's also going to have a Playmaker script for when it basically is destroyed. So let's create that. So let's click here, add an FSM, and let's call this one move. Sorry, just looking for my notes. Okay, so this particular script is going to be pretty simple in terms of states again, which is great. The first thing we want to do is we want to do the get axis action. So a little bit about this action. This action is pretty sweet. Unity has a sort of stored variables or stored states for what input is. So for example, on your keyboard, on a PC keyboard, there are the arrow keys, and there's also W, A, S, and D. There's also the ability to say plug in a control pad, and Unity sort of combines all of these things in this one action, get axis, right? So for us, we need to type in horizontal, right? Right here in this axis name, and spelling it matters, and so does capitalization. So make sure you type it exactly right. Horizontal, right? Notice in the multiplier here, you can try whatever settings you like. This is a good place where you'll balance how the game feels. I did a multiplier of 2.5 and it felt pretty great. But this is going to grab input for the player moving left to right. So do that, and then we want to store this as a variable, and I'm going to give this a name called horizontal. Okay. Now I'm going to copy this action, just do it again, or you can have the action. You can open up the action browser if you'd like and do that. And now instead though of horizontal, I'm going to do vertical. And on the vertical one, I'm going to do 3, a multiplier. Okay, so now we've got inputs, both vertical and horizontal, and we're storing those as variables. So whenever the player presses a button, like a W, A, S, or D, or an arrow key, we're going to store that button press. We're going to multiply it by a 2.5 or a 3, depending on what they press, and then we're storing it as a variable. So now we want to do something with it. And this is where Unity Physics comes in. We're going to use a Unity Physics action called add force. So on add force, on the X axis, we want to do horizontal. And on the Y, we want to do vertical. Oh, I'm sorry, we didn't actually do vertical. So let's make a new variable, call it called vertical. That'll be helpful. Yep. And on the Y, we do vertical. And we do want to do every frame, so make sure you have that checked. And that's the move action. Let me rename this to move. Oh, and sometimes it won't actually update here in the UI until you come off the object. So I'm going to just hit move, come off, back on again. Yeah, there's move. And then let's give that first state, you know, a good name so we will remember. All right, let's give it a try and find out what happens. So press play. Yeah, we don't see anything because that's because our camera is not pointed at the rocket. So let's turn play off. And let's go back to our player object. There it is. All right, I'm going to switch back to 3D mode. And then let's get our main camera centered on that. Now, my main camera is not too far away. Yours may be. There's, you know, just need to basically move the camera to where the rocket is in his view. Oh, that's way off. Look at that. It's just to save time. I'm going to take the main camera, drag it to the player object, and then I'm going to reset position. So, right? I'd recommend you do that too because we need to parent the main camera to the rocket anyway. So once you get that parented, just kind of scroll back a little bit. I'm going to go a little further back. And you can mess with this as well to find the thing that works for you. Whatever works best for your aesthetic. All right, so now let's press play. Okay, fuel remaining 0, speed is 0. Let's press any one of the keys. I'm pressing W and I am moving. And you can't really tell that I'm moving because I have nothing to compare it to. So let's add in a couple of objects. So just right click here in the scene and do like a cube or a sphere maybe. Add some asteroids. I'm going to make that extra big. And just to make sure it's sort of on the same Z as my. I'm going to just copy that a couple of times. All right, once you have a few objects, just to kind of give you a sense of scale, get that in there. Oh, and my camera's too far forward, so let's go back to my player, my main camera. I'm going to pull that back a bit further. There we go. Okay, now let's give it a try. Yeah, and if you let go of the key, your rocket should continue to drift. And notice my speed stays the same. Now I press down and I'm slowing my ship down. I keep pressing down. I'll start going fast in the other direction and we move on down. All right, we're going to stop here, and when we come back next time we will do some fuel remaining on the ship and we'll disable controls based on the fuel.